Welcome, weary traveler of thoughts, dreamer of distant worlds, and curious soul who seeks not the loud tales of triumph, but the quiet, half-buried stories that history leaves behind. Tonight, you find yourself not in the thunder of victory, but in the silence before the storm, in the stillness of a muddy field just beyond the waking edge of medieval memory, where men once prepared for horror, not with cries of courage, but with hands trembling against the chill of dawn. And before we set foot into those bleak and forgotten places, I ask gently, how are you tonight? Are you safe and warm? Where are you listening from? Perhaps you're wrapped in soft linen sheets or tucked beneath a favorite blanket worn at the edges, the scent of something comforting close by, a lavender candle, the last steep of chamomile, or maybe the earthy quiet of rain against your window. Wherever you are, whoever you are welcome here. And if these slow, sleepy tales ease your mind and still the tide of your thoughts, do consider liking this video, subscribing to this little channel, and joining me again for many more journeys across the hush of history. Now let your shoulders drop, your breath soften, and your gaze grow distant as we begin tonight's story. Not with kings or great sieges, not with dragons or drums, but with the muffled footfalls of nameless men rising before first light, in a world where battle was not a noble pursuit, but a grim demand placed on peasants whose lives were ruled more by the soil beneath their boots than the swords in their hands. Imagine, if you will, the slow unraveling of mist over a field just outside a thatched hamlet. This is not a place marked on any map, but it existed in dozens, hundreds of forms scattered across the lands of medieval Europe. From the low hills of Sussex to the frostbitten ridges near the Elbe, from the dark forests of Gaul to the pale, sun-washed stretches of Castile, each with its own dialect, its own saints, its own soil, and yet eerily the same in morning. The village is small, perhaps 24 dwellings arranged like a crescent moon, bowed inward around a cracked well where the bucket creaks on its rope like an old man's groan. Around it, chickens scratch the mud and pigs grunt in straw pens. And the smell, oh, the smell is one of smoked dung, wet hay, and meat hung too long in the smokehouse. Already, someone is awake. A boy, no older than 9, clutches a dented pail in both hands, trudging from the well to a low doorway where a woman kneads rye dough in a wooden trough, her elbows dusted in flour and her eyes rimmed with the weight of sleeplessness. Her breath rises in clouds, mingling with the faint steam of the bread oven just beginning to glow. And behind her, in the gloom of the cottage, the faint cough of a child not yet well. A reminder that peace, when it comes, does not always bring health or comfort. And now, outside, other men begin to appear, moving slowly, reluctantly, some yawning, others quiet, a few pausing to stretch aching backs from a restless night spent on flea-bitten pallets. They are not soldiers, remember this, they are millers, plowmen, shepherds, coopers, and brewers, each with hands rough from labor but unfamiliar with violence, each carrying a weapon not forged for war but borrowed from daily life. A scythe bound with leather cord, a butcher's cleaver, a long-handled axe better suited for splitting timber than skulls. One man wears a padded jack sewn by his wife just 3 nights ago, each stitch laid with whispered prayers, while another clutches a round shield painted hastily with red ochre and ash. Its surface cracked, its edges raw. They gather, not with the clamor of armies, but in a sort of muted confusion, like men called to work on a day they do not understand. Only the reeve, a man with gray in his beard and the weight of authority in his gaze, knows where to stand, and even he squints eastward toward the distant tree-line, as if hoping this day might somehow vanish with the mist. And now the sun creeps higher, a weak, pale disk behind clouds. casting no warmth, only light, enough to see the ruts in the road and the frost on the grass, enough to realize that today will not be ordinary. Again, I invite you to imagine it. The dirt beneath their feet cold and sticky, clinging to worn leather shoes, the smell of onions on breath from a hurried breakfast, the low murmur of a Latin prayer whispered by one man clutching a rosary carved from bone. There is fear here, thick as the morning fog, but no one speaks of it. They talk instead of sheep stolen in the night, of a neighbor's daughter betrothed to a distant cousin, of whether the millstone will need replacing come spring. But beneath their words, the silence pulses, growing louder, heavier, and now a rider appears. His horse is lanky, rib-boned, with burrs in its mane and a rope for reins, but he wears a surcoat marked with the sigil of the local lord, and his words, though spoken plainly, crack the air like a whip. All able men to muster, we march before noon. There is no drum, no trumpet, no grand proclamation, only the shuffling of boots, the clatter of pots hastily emptied of food to make room for flint, twine, and a crust of bread. Wives step back, silent, eyes gleaming with unshed tears. Children peer from doorways, unsure whether to wave or hide. The men do not speak, not now, not as they begin to form into lines, awkward and crooked, some adjusting belts, others trying to remember which end of a spear faces outward. One boy, no older than 14, carries his father's hammer, the handle still stained with soot from the forge. It is too heavy for him, and yet he grips it with knuckles white as linen. Again, imagine this, not as a scene from a storybook or a tapestry, but as life, as it truly was, the smells of wool and sweat, the creak of cartwheels, the rustle of cloaks pulled tighter against the cold, the low chant of psalms rising from the lips of men who, yesterday, tended barley fields and today are asked to kill or be killed. And all around them, the land remains still. The cows in the pasture chew placidly, the birds will overhead, the wind tugs at the edges of thatched roofs as if to say, war is not our way. Yet it has come, and the march begins, not in rhythm, but in discomfort, each man stepping forward with hesitation, leaving behind more than just his hearth, but perhaps his peace, his limb, his name. This is how battle begins. Not with glory, but with reluctant feet and hollow bellies, with bread wrapped in linen and the sound of a baby's cry growing fainter behind you. And so they walked, not in unison like trained legions, but in clumps and clusters like sheep herded under gray skies, a thin procession stretching along a rut-worn track where grass had long given up its struggle beneath the ironclad weight of hooves, wheels, and weary feet. Ahead lay no banners waving with pride, only the unknown, a place whispered of in markets and chapels, where some distant rival lord gathered his own ragtag army of shivering men to settle disputes neither side truly understood. Behind, the village shrank in a mist, its cottages and fence posts dissolving like old memories into the folds of the countryside, and soon only the crows remained, circling lazily above the trail as if sensing what was to come. The march was long, not measured in miles, but in blisters and breath. In the subtle erosion of dignity as cold crept into toes and knees ached from uneven stone paths, as cloaks grew heavy with drizzle and shoes wore thin along the soles. Have you ever walked so far your mind drifted like a boat at sea, no longer tethered to step or direction? That was the rhythm of these men now. Many of them farmers and craftsmen pulled from their fields with barely a day's notice, trudging through the hours not with conviction but quiet resignation, the kind born not of bravery but of lack of choice. The road was not a road at all, but a muddy scar that curved between hedgerows and bogs, dotted with the black pools of recent rain. the air thick with the smell of damp leaves, wet wool, and the faint tang of sweat that grew stronger with each hour. And still they walked, one foot, then the other, stopping only when the reeve signaled or when a mule collapsed under the weight of water barrels and sacks of barley that had already begun to sour. Their meals were simple, eaten without ceremony, just a crust of rice soaked in rainwater or a handful of raw onions that stung the eyes and coated the tongue with bitterness. There were no flasks of wine, only sloshing skins of weak ale or cold broth, and when that ran out, they drank from puddles or licked condensation from the curved blades of their tools. Again, picture it. Not a march of heroes, but of fathers and sons, of men whose fingers were better suited for weaving baskets than wrapping around spear. Shafts, whose backs were bent from years of lifting hay, not lifting swords. Conversation, when it came, was hushed and short. A grumble about the weather, a muttered joke about the reeve's nose, a shared memory of a feast that now seemed impossibly distant. The younger ones tried to sing at first, but their voices cracked and faltered, fading into silence like the last notes of a fading lute. Some carried charms, ribbons tied around fingers, bits of saints' bones sewn into sleeves, wooden crosses rubbed smooth by anxious thumbs. One man wore his wife's shawl tucked beneath his jerkin, claiming its warmth warded off evil spirits, while another clutched a handful of dried lavender given to him by a daughter too small to understand where he was going, only that he was going away. And the hours dragged. First morning, then the sluggish drift into midday when the sun, barely seen through low clouds, offered a brief illusion of warmth before vanishing again into gray. Their shadows, what few they cast, were long and misshapen, stretching beside them like specters on the move, silent reminders that the worst was not behind them but ahead. By afternoon, feet were blistered, rubbed raw against stiff boots, or, in many cases, mere wrappings of cloth and twine. Some limped, others tied rushes around their ankles to cushion the pain, but still they marched, past crumbling stone walls where ivy clung like old secrets, through hollowed woods where the trees stood like watchful sentries, their bare limbs creaking softly in the wind like voices trying to speak. And now, imagine the quiet, broken only by the scuff of leather against gravel, the faint clink of a belt buckle, the soft hum of breath exhaled in rhythm. There were no drums, no songs of war, only the monotonous repetition of step after step, each one pulling them farther from home and closer to something none dared name. A priest rode among them, his donkey laden with scrolls and salves, muttering verses beneath his breath as if trying to keep the devil at bay with syllables alone. He offered blessings to those who asked, last rites to those who limped too hard, and sometimes simply a hand on the shoulder, wordless but steady. The reeve, grizzled and silent, rode ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the path as if searching not for enemies, but for signs that this march might soon end, that they might reach their assigned post or be told to turn back, that perhaps this show of force would be enough to settle things without blood. But deep down, they knew better, knew that lords who called for levies rarely cared to stop the wheel once it began to turn. And so they walked on, past abandoned cottages and broken shrines, past stones carved with runes no one could read anymore, past wells where old women once whispered wishes and young boys once dared each other to look inside. The world seemed to grow older with each step, the trees taller, the sky heavier, the soil darker, until finally, just as twilight began to touch the edges of the sky with bruised purple and pale gold, the reeve raised a hand and called a halt. They stopped in a clearing bordered by twisted oaks, where the earth was damp and soft, good for tents if any had them, though most did not. Only cloaks, canvas scraps, and a few woven mats. Fires were forbidden, lest they give away their position. so they huddled together for warmth, sharing breath and body heat like animals in winter. The priest offered prayer again, barely audible over the moaning of tired limbs and the shifting of restless bodies trying to find sleep on earth that offered little comfort. And now, picture it again. 100 men wrapped in cloaks like shadows, curled under branches that groaned in the wind, each one staring into the dark or up at the stars, wondering if this night would be their last, or if worse still lay ahead. And overhead, the moon watched, pale and expressionless, as it had done 1,000 times before, casting its cold light over men who had never known it so bright, so silent, so utterly distant. In this stillness, fear became something solid, not loud or sharp, but heavy and persistent, like a stone in the gut or a whisper. That never ends. Some wept quietly, others prayed, and a few simply stared, blank-eyed, jaws clenched, lost already in battles that had not yet come. And so ended the day, not with songs or ceremony, but with the quiet whimper of a boy who missed his mother, and the slow, steady breathing of men trying to pretend they weren't afraid. As the moon arched higher and the last whisper of twilight was pulled like a curtain beyond the distant hills, the world shrank into darkness, and the men who had walked all day in the rhythm of reluctant obedience now found themselves motionless, wrapped in cloaks that barely kept the chill from their bones, each curled beneath the vast, breathless sky as the hours grew longer and quieter with every passing moment. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes on the night before battle. Not the peaceful kind, not the warm hush of a meadow in summer or the cozy hush of a candlelit chamber, but a frozen, listening silence, as if even the wind has paused to see what the next sunrise will bring. The camp, if it could be called such, was little more than scattered bodies huddled in knots along the tree-line and across the soft, damp earth of a hollow that smelled of moss and loam, with only a few crude canvas coverings lashed between branches for those tasked with watching the perimeter, while the rest tried, and failed, to sleep. Some whispered prayers beneath their breath, repeating them again and again like lullabies passed down from grandmothers who never imagined their words would be used beside blades and bows, while others simply stared at the star-dappled sky, trying to find comfort in the familiar. Constellations, Orion, the hunter, a shape they'd traced in the heavens since boyhood, now seeming almost cruel in its steadiness, a figure of eternal readiness while they lay shivering, untrained, and unsure. Have you ever felt your heart beat so slowly you could hear the blood in your ears? Not from exertion, but from waiting. That was the rhythm now, a soft internal drum pulsing beneath ribs wrapped in linen and wool. A steady reminder that the body fears what it cannot fight, and even more, what it must fight without understanding. The Reeve sat by a tree stump, sharpening a blade that had seen more pigs than men, his face lit by the pale silver spill of moonlight through bare branches. He did not speak, for there was nothing more to say, only the occasional glance toward the priest, who was pacing along a crooked path traced into the mud by the movement of tired boots, his hands clasped around a tiny wooden crucifix that swayed with each step. The priest, younger than most, had not yet seen true war. His sermons had been delivered to old women and farm boys, his Latin crisp but mechanical, his faith still warm like newly fired clay, soft in places where it should have been firm. Yet even he felt it now, the weight of what morning might bring, and his prayers grew quieter, more desperate, as if he feared they would be overheard by something darker than death. And all around them, the men breathed in shallow, uneven patterns, some with closed eyes, others blinking into the void, and a few muttering to themselves, their minds already fraying from the tension like threads pulling loose from the hem of an old tunic. One man, a tanner by trade, sat with his knees tucked to his chest and hummed a lullaby his wife once sang to their son, his voice barely above the rustle of grass, cracked and tuneless, but rhythmic in a way that made it clear he wasn't singing for anyone but himself. Another, barely more than a boy, clutched his father's dagger and kept stabbing it into the earth, over and over, each motion identical to the last, as if by practicing the gesture, he could become less afraid of what it might mean come dawn. And still, no one slept. Sleep, in these hours, became not a comfort but a dare, a game of courage where closing your eyes meant risking visions, memories, or dreams worse than the reality waiting just beyond the horizon. Have you ever laid awake, not from noise, but from silence so profound that it felt like it was pressing against your skin? That was a night now, pressing against every man in that clearing, seeping into boots and bones, a stillness that whispered things best left unspoken. The sounds that did come, an owl calling, the creak of wood, the soft clink of metal on leather, only heightened the sense of aloneness, for each noise proved how awake they still were, how far from sleep, how wide the gulf between now and whatever fate morning would bring. And then came the talk, not loud, not organized, but in drifting pieces, like leaves blown across a courtyard. Old tales of battlefield ghosts who walked the lines at night, touching the foreheads of those marked for death, stories of men who vanished the day before a fight, only to be found later in a tree with their eyes turned to glass, as if they'd seen something not of this world. The youngest men listened with wide eyes, too tired to laugh and too frightened to ask questions, while the older ones added their own layers to the legend. One spoke of a faceless rider who appeared before great losses, another of an angel seen weeping in the clouds before a storm. These weren't superstitions they shared in jest, but traditions, ritualistic exchanges meant to soothe the spirit even as they fed the fear. Small torches passed from one soul to another in a place where no other light remained. And there were other murmurs too, less fantastical, more intimate. If I don't come back, tell Marta she needn't wait long. One man said softly, half to himself, "My boots. I want my boy to have them. They're the best thing I've got." Another whispered to the priest, who only nodded and wrote the name in the dirt with a twig, knowing the rain would soon erase it. Such quiet farewells were scattered like seeds across that haunted patch of ground, and though few would remember them in detail, the sorrow they carried would linger like smoke after a fire, imperceptible, but clinging to everything, and slowly, in fits and starts. Some did sleep, not deeply, not well, but in the shallow, fragmented way a man might doze on the edge of danger, where every twig snap feels like a scream and every gust of wind like the flap of an enemy's banner. Dreams came sharp and disjointed, visions of wives waving from doorways, of rotting teeth falling from mouths, of horses with bleeding eyes and swords made of ice. Some awoke shouting, only to be hushed by nearby hands. Others jerked upright, gasping, their hearts pounding like hooves against dry earth. But the hours wore on, and finally, after what felt like years compressed into a single, sleepless stretch of night, the eastern sky began to pale, turning from pitch to ash to the faintest hint of blue, like a lid being slowly lifted from a jar of ink. The men stirred, groaning, rubbing eyes and shoulders, pulling stiff limbs from damp earth, and even the trees seemed to groan with them as the cold deepened just before dawn, the last cruel joke of night. Birds did not sing, not here, not now, but the silence itself began to shift, no longer peaceful or foreboding, but anticipatory, like a held breath waiting to be exhaled. The reeve stood first, rubbing his eyes and stretching his arms in a motion both tired and ceremonial, then called for ranks. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. as if shouting might shatter something fragile in the air. The men obeyed one by one, rising from their nests and gathering their weapons, many of which had been laid beside them like faithful dogs, always within reach. And so they stood, shoulder to shoulder, facing nothing and everything, the horizon still veiled in mist, their faces drawn but firm, their eyes dark with something that was not yet grief, but already past fear. The priest moved among them, offering blessings not in Latin, but in plain speech, touching foreheads, drawing crosses in air that steamed with breath, whispering, "You are not alone," to men who had never felt more isolated. And once more, the long stillness stretched, holding them in its grasp, cradling them in a moment of not quite war and not quite peace. A liminal space where time itself seemed reluctant to move forward, as if the world wanted to spare them just one more second before it all began. And perhaps for that brief interval, they were not soldiers or victims or names soon to be forgotten, but simply men, standing together beneath a waking sky, listening for the sound of a horn that had not yet blown. And then at last, though no man wanted it and none were ready, morning tipped its weight forward and spilled into day, not with songbirds or golden light, but with a gray sky heavy as lead and a cold that clung to fingers and cheeks like damp wool. And with it came the movement, subtle at first, like a ripple in water when a single stone breaks the surface. The sound reached them before the shape did, a distant drumming, not from war drums, but hooves and feet, a kind of thunderless rumble, muffled by terrain, but growing steadily, impossibly slow, and yet unbearably certain. A command was given, not shouted, but passed from one man to the next like a torch in the dark. And so they moved, these tired, stiff-limbed villagers with blisters and bruises still fresh from the march, now forming into something resembling a line. Crooked, uneven, jittery, but a line all the same. Because even men who have never known war understand, deep in their bones, that standing together is better than falling alone. Their weapons, hammers, scythes, clubs wrapped in cloth, dented shields, notched blades, and even pitchforks, were gripped tightly, though fingers trembled and palms sweated cold. Ahead, the enemy came into view slowly, like phantoms forming from mist, their silhouettes dark and hunched beneath their own banners, just as makeshift, just as frightened, just as desperately human. And in that moment, before the first cry, before the first rush, time seemed to pause, as if even the earth itself held its breath, and many later claimed that all sound vanished except for their own heartbeat and the rasp of their breath in their throats, like straw drawn across dry wood. Then came the cry, not noble, not clear, but ragged, hoarse, a choked scream pulled from the lungs of someone who had waited too long to be afraid. And with it the line began to move forward, not in a clean charge, but in a staggering rush of limbs and weapons and breath and sheer, desperate momentum. The two sides collided not like dancers in choreographed battle, but like carts crashing in the dark. A mass of tangled bodies, swinging arms, shouted curses, splinters and steel, and mud splashing up as boots lost their grip and men fell hard. Bones jarred, faces scraped against frozen earth. Again, imagine it. Not the clean strikes of knights in shining mail, but the messy, clumsy tangle of fear and fury, where a man's swing with a butcher's knife misses and catches not an enemy, but his own comrade's shoulder, where a shield breaks not from force, but from rot, where someone drops their weapon and scrambles for it in the mud, only to be crushed beneath the weight of falling bodies. The air filled quickly with the stink of sweat and blood and iron, with cries of pain and panic, with the breathless gasps of men who'd never struck anything harder than a stump, now watching teeth fly from mouths and hands split open under rusted blades. One man swung his scythe wildly, carving a crescent of air before being pulled down by two others and stabbed in the ribs with what looked like a broken awl. Another tried to run, but was tackled and pounded with fists and boots until he lay still, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Have you ever seen chaos so complete that your mind could not tell which way was forward? That was battle in those first minutes. A knot of motion and sound where time broke apart and every second stretched long with terror. A knight rode through at one point, tall on his black horse, his sword gleaming wet, his face hidden behind a helmet shaped like a wolf. He shouted something, but no one heard, and his presence, rather than inspiring, was like a storm cloud passing overhead, a reminder that in this struggle of farmers, true warriors were rare but devastating. And then came the arrows, launched not in elegant volleys, but in ragged, panicked waves, loosed by half-trained bowmen who could barely see past the fog and smoke of breath, their shafts hissing like whispers through the air, some striking shields with dull thuds, others slicing through necks or sinking deep into thighs and bellies, where they stayed, jutting grotesquely like branches growing from flesh. A boy, barely more than 12, was hit in the eye and crumpled silently beside a man who didn't notice until he slipped on the boy's blood and fell, his own weapon flying from his grasp. Screams now, not of anger, but of agony, echoing louder than any battle hymn. Cries for mothers, for saints, for water, for mercy. The mud turned red, then black, churned beneath trampling feet until the ground itself seemed to bleed, and the sky, still gray, gave no warmth, no sign that the sun cared to rise fully upon such a scene. And still they fought. Those who could, grappling, striking, biting even, as if their ancestors had returned in them as beasts, not men, and the line bent, broke, reformed, and broke again, like a rope fraying under too much. Strain, imagine it again. The dull weight of a wooden club striking a shoulder, the sharp snap of a rib cracking, the wet sound of a blade pushed into a belly, and the way the breath hitches in the chest when it cannot understand what just happened. Men fought on their knees, crawling through corpses to find a dropped axe, weeping as they moved, and in some cases, simply falling where they stood, too exhausted or broken to go on. The priest tried to reach the wounded, stepping carefully, offering final words to those beyond saving, crossing himself again and again until his fingers trembled and he dropped his crucifix into the mud, where it disappeared beneath a fallen man's boot. The reeve was still alive, swinging with a smith's hammer, his beard soaked with blood, not his own, shouting names of saints like curses. But even he slowed as the chaos surged again and again and again, like a tide that refused to retreat. Have you ever seen hope leave a face? Not drift, not fade, but simply vanish as if snatched away in an instant. That look was everywhere now, eyes gone glassy, lips trembling, mouths opening and closing like fish on dry land. Some tried to surrender, raising hands, throwing down weapons, but in the noise, in the rage, it made no difference, friend, foe. It was all blur and movement and the animal urge to survive. And above all, the sky remained indifferent, a dome of dull gray staring down on a world that had torn itself open, showing the raw, red core beneath. And when the end finally began, because no battle ends all at once, but in pieces with some lines giving way, some men fleeing, some simply laying down. It wasn't marked by trumpets or cheers, but by silence, not all at once, but slowly as blades stopped moving and hands fell to sides, as groans replaced cries and the shuffle of feet became stillness, as the smoke cleared and what was left became visible. The twisted heaps of broken men, shields split like firewood, weapons embedded in bodies too still to scream, blood pooled in hoof prints, in footprints, in the hollows of helmets. And the survivors, if they could be called such, stood panting, swaying, gripping their knees or staring at their hands as if seeing them for the first time, slick and red, trembling as if frost had bitten deep into the bone. And no one smiled, no one sang, for there was no victory, only ending, and the beginning of grief. And then there was nothing, not the kind of nothing that comes with peace or sleep, but the hollow, breathless void that follows the unraveling of something fragile and precious, something once human and now unrecognizable. The battle had ended, though no one had declared it so, and in place of noise and fury there hung a silence so deep it swallowed every breath, every step, every thought, like a thick fog poured into the skull. And the field, if it could still be called that, lay blanketed in a motionless sprawl of limbs and metal and dirt churned into a paste too dark to name. The survivors, scattered in clumps like the last leaves on a frostbitten tree, wandered without direction, some kneeling beside fallen friends and family, others staring at the horizon as if searching for a reason, a meaning, anything to hold on to in the brutal clarity of morning. The sun had risen at last, but its light was thin, yellow-gray, filtered through smoke and cold mist, revealing too much and offering no warmth. Imagine now the scent, a thick, rotting blend of iron and bile, sweat and dung, smoke and blood and ruptured skin, the kind of smell that clings to the throat and buries itself in the folds of a tunic, a smell you cannot wash off no matter how long you scrub. The dead lay as they had fallen, some curled like children, others flung wide, as if reaching for mercy that never came, their faces frozen in the final twist of fear, surprise, or pain. The blood had soaked into the earth in wide arcs and strange patterns, as if the land itself had tried to map the chaos, had tried to record it in ink that never dries. Birds circled above, black wings against a pale sky, drawn by instinct, their cries sharp and cruel in the quiet, and still no one spoke, not truly, not yet. A man wept beside a boy, no older than 13, whose chest had been split open like firewood, his ribs pale and sharp beneath the torn wool of a tunic once green and now a deep, wet maroon. Another dug a shallow trench with his hands, fingers bleeding, to bury what remained of his brother, whose head was missing, whose boots had been taken. And around them, other men moved slowly, clumsily, gathering weapons, collecting shields, stacking the dead, not with reverence, but necessity. For they knew the scavengers would come soon, not just the animals, but men too. Those who looted rings and purses from fingers still warm. Those who pulled mail from cooling corpses, who stripped the dead bare to sell their clothes in the next town. Some bodies were unrecognizable, faces smashed, eyes gone, hair soaked in gore, and in these a strange mercy lived. The living could not mourn what they could not name, and still others clung to the last remnants of breath, gurgling softly as lungs filled with blood, whispering names of mothers, of saints, of old loves, of no one in particular. And among them walked the priest, his robe torn, his hands trembling, offering final word with a voice nearly broken from the weeping he had done in silence before the sun rose, now trying, with what little strength remained, to offer comfort not just to the dying but to the living, to remind them they were not beasts, not holy, not yet. The reeve, too, remained upright, his arm bound in a torn sash, his face swollen and smeared with ash. He gave orders gently now, not with the bark of command, but the heavy cadence of a man who had seen too much and could no longer pretend otherwise. Lay them side by side, he murmured. We'll bless them before the cart arrives. And his words moved through the field like wind, through reeds, soft, almost forgotten before they reached the next ear. Have you ever stood in a place that felt both holy and cursed, where the very ground seemed to echo with what had just occurred. That was the field now, no longer a patch of earth, but a shrine of violence, a tomb for voices that would never again speak, a monument to the unremarked suffering of men who had no histories written for them. And still they worked. The ones who remained, because work gave the hands purpose and spared the mind the burden of thought, shaking corpses gently, just in case, closing eyes that stared too wide, arranging limbs into a semblance of peace, though nothing could erase the brutal indignities of how they had died. Nearby, a boy with red hair sat cross-legged, staring at his own bloodied fingers, opening and closing his hands slowly, as if testing whether they still belonged to him, as if they might float away if he loosened his grip. He had not spoken since the charge began, had simply moved with the others, swung his weapon once, maybe twice, and now he was here, untouched, but changed, as if his very soul had been bent out of shape by the sound of a man choking on his own blood. And not far from him, a woman wandered among the fallen, calling a name over and over, the same name, Thomas, 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 until her voice cracked and she sank to her knees, pressing her face into the tunic of a corpse that looked close enough to pass for her son, even if it wasn't. No one stopped her because grief has its own rituals, and in that place, all rituals were honored. And through it all, time did not seem to move. Hours passed like minutes, minutes like days, and the field remained stuck between two moments. The one before the killing began, and the one where memory had not yet formed to explain why it had happened at all. Crows landed now, bold and quick, hopping between the dead, plucking at ears and lips and tongues, and still the men moved, stacking, praying, crying, sometimes laughing in small bursts that meant nothing, small explosions of madness released to make space for breath. And when carts finally arrived, pulled by donkeys with heads bowed low, the work became heavier, lifting, dragging, folding bodies like bundles of cloth, loading them not by name but by weight, by convenience, because there were too many to do otherwise. And somewhere in that moment, someone began to sing, not loudly, not with skill, but with a soft, cracked voice that floated above the field like smoke, a lullaby perhaps, or a hymn forgotten in its origin, repeated only for the comfort of repetition. And others joined, quietly, here and there, a harmony of exhaustion and sorrow. And for a fleeting second the field no longer felt cursed but consecrated, not redeemed but remembered. And as the day waned and the sun dipped low behind the crooked spires of distant pines, the carts rolled away, wheels groaning under the weight of the unnamed, and the men followed on foot, their backs stooped, not from the march but from the burden of what they had seen, what they had done, and what they would carry now in silence for the rest of their lives. And the field, once filled with movement and fury, now lay still again, empty but not quiet, as if the very earth was humming, holding its breath, waiting for grass to grow over blood, for time to do what memory cannot. And in the hush that followed, with only the wind brushing the tall reeds and the last of the birds lifting away into dusk, one might imagine the battle had never happened at all, but it had, and the ground would remember, even if no one else did. And now, with the smoke fading and the field quieted, let us wander not with the dead, but with those left breathing, those whose wounds did not kill them outright, but carved long, slow hours into their lives, hours stitched with agony and filled with the cold breath of infection. Because in the medieval world, to survive a battle was often only the beginning of suffering, not the end. These are the men carried on carts that jolted with every rut in the road, the men laid out in barns or stone chapels, their bodies wrapped in blankets stiff with blood, the stink of iron and rot thick in their breath and clothes, their eyes wide with pain too vast to name, some silent, others whimpering, a few laughing in strange, hollow bursts that made the others stare, because they knew madness often came before fever, and fever came before death. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to survive a wound with no medicine, no antiseptic, no true understanding of what an open body could invite? Imagine, then, a deep cut across the thigh, not stitched but bound tight with old linen, soaked through in moments, tied again and again until the flesh beneath pulsed like a second heart, hot with infection and swollen like overripe fruit. And still the man lives, moaning beneath the care of someone with trembling hands and little more than wine, vinegar, or soot to offer. And yet care was given, clumsy but sincere, by wives, brothers, priests, monks, or midwives whose knowledge was passed not through books, but through watching, through trial and error, through instinct shaped by years of loss. A hot iron was the tool of healing just as much as of war, pressed into wounds not to kill, but to burn shut the leaking edges of torn skin, searing nerve and muscle alike. A sound like meat on a griddle, the scream caught between clenched teeth or released into the rafters like the wail of an animal. And afterward, silence or sobbing or unconsciousness if one was lucky. And still they try to live. Men with shattered arms held in splints of pine and cloth. Men with arrows snapped and pushed clean through to avoid splinters festering inside. Men whose faces were sliced or burned, who could no longer chew or speak without pain. Their mouths swollen, their eyes crusted shut each morning until someone dabbed them gently with a cloth soaked in rainwater or urine or honey, whatever folk believed would chase away the humors that brought the swelling. Again, imagine it. Not a hospital, not even a clean room, but a wooden floor scattered with hay, where rats scurried and flies buzzed, and above them the rafters creaked, and beside them the moans of other wounded men rose and fell like waves, while a priest recited last rites. Over and over in the background, each word a soft metronome marking the passage of bodies from this world to the next. The wounded slept little, and when they did, their dreams were frantic, visions of fire and blood, of endless running, of teeth falling from their mouths like pebbles, of doors that never opened and voices that called but never reached them. And when they woke, there was always pain, dull or sharp, in the belly, in the leg, in the skull, or in the soul. And it became a companion, no longer a visitor but a tenant, something familiar enough to talk to. Some beg for death, and some are granted it, with a pillow pressed softly or a blade turned inward, or sometimes simply through the quiet stilling of breath as the infection reached the lungs or the heart or the brain. But many endured, too stubborn to die or too hopeful to surrender, clinging to the smallest signs of healing. The scab that hardened, the swelling that eased, the first step taken with the help of a stick carved by a friend. Have you ever considered what courage looks like when no one is watching? It looks like a man lifting a cup to his lips with trembling hands, trying to drink broth without spilling it. Or another laughing through cracked lips at a joke he doesn't fully hear. Or a boy with a wrapped stump where his arm once was, learning how to tie a knot with one hand while his mother turns away to hide her tears. And yet these scenes were never recorded, never painted in tapestries or sung in halls. Only the Lord's victories mattered, only the banners and the numbers. But beneath it all were the wounded, the limping, the bent, the coughing, the shivering, those who carried the true cost of war in their altered bodies and broken sleep. Monks sometimes came, with poultices made of crushed sage and lard, or drinks brewed from willow bark and poppy milk, their voices low, their hands slow, whispering words over the wounds, as if kindness could stitch what cloth could not. Others turned to charms, coins tied to wrists, crosses carved into wood and tucked beneath pillows, bones of saints or whispered prayers to long-dead ancestors. And perhaps these things helped. Perhaps belief itself dulled the edge of pain. For in a time where knowledge was scarce, hope often served as the final remedy. Time passed oddly for the wounded, days measured not by the sun, but by bandaged changes, by who lived through the night, by which moans stopped without explanation, by when a wound began to smell sweet, that sickly, honey-rotten scent that told of flesh surrendering to death. Some recovered fully, though never truly whole, their bodies marked forever by scars that twisted when they laughed or stung when it rained. And their minds bore something harder to explain, a stillness, a distance, a quietness in their eyes that did not come from shyness or humility, but from having seen too much. They limped back into the villages one by one, often unannounced, surprising families who had already grieved them, welcomed not with parades, but with tears long, embraces, awkward silences, and the careful joy of those who had learned not to hope too loudly. Others remained in the care of strangers, nursed by those who saw them not as burdens, but as reminders of sons or husbands long lost, their names forgotten, but their healing still tended with patience, and old songs hummed while cloth was pressed to flesh. And some never returned at all, their bodies buried in shallow graves behind barns or under apple trees, marked by nothing but a stone or a handful of wildflowers, remembered only by the way someone paused when passing that spot, or the extra loaf baked during harvest, just in case. And so the wounded became ghosts of the living, men who had survived the sword but not the memory, who walked among the hail like shadows that flickered when the wind blew. In the cold of winter, their joints ached with the memory of that morning clash, their dreams still thick with smoke and screams, and their scars itched with the change of season, as if the skin itself remembered the blade. And yet they endured, not as heroes, but as reminders, not in songs, but in silences, in glances, in the pauses between laughter at the tavern, in the hands that trembled when reaching for a spoon, in the eyes that refused to look too long at firelight. And as years passed, their stories blurred, even to themselves, what was real and what was dream, what was screamed and what was only imagined. But the pain never blurred, the limp never softened, and the memory of lying in a dark barn, listening to others die around them, that remained clear, sharper than the blade itself. And so they lived, quietly, stubbornly, painfully, each day a small defiance, each breath a quiet protest against the cruelty of fate, and though their names were never etched in stone, their lives etched themselves into the soil, into the doorways they passed through, into the arms they once held, into the fields they never plowed again, into the stillness they left behind. And after the steel had fallen silent, and the smoke had cleared, and the dying had slowed to a trickle of soft gasps and final prayers, after the carts had rolled away, creaking beneath the weight of the dead and the nearly dead, after the tents had been taken down, the banners lowered, the arrows gathered, and the ravens fed, the war, as wars always do, moved on, shifting its weight toward the next village, the next valley, the next hilltop, leaving behind not stories, not songs, but a kind of silence that few ever speak of, the silence that drapes itself over a village once touched by battle, a silence thick as ash and stubborn as drought, a silence that nestles in the folds of clothing, in the grain of wood, in the glances exchanged across a hearth where someone once sat and now does not. The fields, torn and trampled, were left to regrow without apology, and the farmers, those who could still walk, those whose sons had not been buried in a ditch, returned with bent backs and quiet steps, their sides heavier now, not from metal, but memory, their hands rougher, not from labor, but from gripping a blade meant for other men's bellies. Have you ever stood in a place where people avoid looking at the same empty chair? That was the feeling now, day after day, as life tried to resume, like a wheel broken and repaired with mismatched wood and bent nails. The baker returned to his oven, though he no longer whistled, and his flour was dustier, more scattered, and his loaves were smaller, as if even bread mourned. The blacksmith lit his forge, but the rhythm of hammer against anvil had lost its song. It rang hollow now, echoing against walls that had seen his eldest carried away and not returned, his tools placed with care, but never with joy. And the children, those who remained, no longer played at swords or knights, no longer chased each other through the market with wooden daggers or makeshift banners, because they had seen too much, heard too much, or felt the absence of a brother or cousin too closely to pretend anymore. Even the animals seemed subdued. The goats bleated less, the dogs howled at night without reason, and the horses flinched at every sudden noise, as if the ghosts of galloping still echoed in their bones. And the women, whose grief was quieter, often unseen, carried on with the aching grace that only centuries of loss could teach. They swept doorways where no one would return. They tended gardens alone. They spun while beside hearths grown cold, their fingers moving without pause, without protest. Because mourning had no beginning and no end, only the soft rhythm of motion without reward. And in the churches, the prayers were softer now, less urgent but more persistent, as if offered not in hope, but in habit, a tether to something higher only because nothing remained below. Funerals came not with bells, but with nods, shallow graves dug by neighbors who no longer needed to ask for whom, just where. And slowly, too slowly to notice, the war became a shape in the background, like a stain, that never quite fades from cloth, always there, in the edge of vision, in a way hands shook at certain sounds, in a way no one walked alone after dusk. The seasons changed, as they always do, indifferent and patient. The snow came and softened the earth, hiding scars in white silence. And spring followed with green shoots pushing through the blood-dark soil. And the harvest returned, though the sheaves were fewer, the baskets lighter, the wine a bit more bitter, as if the land itself remembered. Some villagers spoke less and worked more. Their lives narrowed to tasks that filled the daylight and exhausted the night. And in this endless rhythm, they found a kind of healing, not joy, not quite, but a kind of numbness that felt like peace when compared to the chaos before. A few could not stay. They wandered from the village one morning and did not return, taking nothing, saying nothing, only leaving behind an empty bed and the quiet knowledge that they had gone in search of something that could not be found. Have you ever watched someone carry a burden so well that you almost forget it's there? That was the way now, as men with twisted knees and sunken eyes sat at taverns, with smiles that did not reach their brows, as widows laughed at jokes that stung, as children learned to sing without the names of their fathers in the verses. The village changed, not in its buildings, but in its breath, its pulse, faster in the night, slower in the morning, uneven and unsure, like a man recovering from a fever that nearly killed him. Even the festivals, when they came, felt thinner. Candles lit in windows, yes, and garlands hung from doorways, yes, but the music was hesitant, the dancing short-lived, the fire smaller than in years past, as if the people feared that joy itself might offend the spirits of those who never came home. And yet, life continued. It always does. Not because it forgets, but because it must, because crops must be sown, and bread must be baked, and children grow taller, even as they walk with a limp. And so, in time, the war became a tale told in half-whispers, shared around fire pits with mugs of weak ale and the occasional crack of laughter that broke too quickly, and the names of the fallen were carved into wood, sometimes, or etched into the soft stone of the churchyard wall, or simply remembered in the way someone turned their head when a familiar song played. or how a child was given a name once shouted across a battlefield. The reeve no longer spoke of that day, though he walked slower now and drank more often and sometimes forgot where he was mid-sentence. The priest's sermons grew gentler, less fiery, as if even God had wept beside him that morning, and the bells, when they rang, did so with a quieter timbre, as if they too had aged. And above it all, the sky remained the same, wide, patient, pale in the morning and dark at dusk, watching without. Judgment, offering no answer to the questions the villagers no longer asked aloud. And so, the silence remained, not empty, but full of names, of sighs, of footsteps that would never return, of prayers whispered in the dark, of lullabies hummed by women to children whose eyes bore the memories of men. And in that silence, the village endured, not proudly, not loudly, but fully, completely, as if by carrying its pain in silence. It honored the dead more surely than any monument could. And perhaps that is what survival means. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of memory woven so tightly into the cloth of daily life that it no longer scratches the skin, but simply warms it. But what of the mind, you might wonder, when the flesh had healed and the scabs had flaked away and the bones had set as best they could beneath crooked splints and knotted cloth? What of the soul that lingered behind the eyes? The unseen hurt that did not bleed, did not bruise, did not swell, but instead sat quiet and deep, like a stone at the bottom of a well, always there, always waiting for those who returned from battle, those who limped home, those who rode in carts, those who drifted through the village like shadows with names. The wounds inside often spoke louder than the ones the body wore. These men, and sometimes women too, carried with them a kind of weight that no one else could quite see, a silence in their laughter, a twitch at sudden sounds, a gaze that stared too long at nothing. And though the word trauma had not yet found its way into the tongue of peasants or priests, the symptoms were there, plain as winter frost, plain as hunger after a poor harvest. In the middle of the night, in rooms with cracked shutters and straw-stuffed mattresses, they would wake without knowing why, gasping, clutching the wool at their throats, hearts pounding as if the battle had returned beneath their skin. They heard things sometimes, not always, clearly, but enough to make their hands tremble. Phantom hoofbeats on dry ground, the whisper of arrows through branches, the wet rasp of breath in a man's last seconds. And when they turned to see, of course, there was nothing there, only a lantern swaying slightly or a dog scratching at the door. The villagers whispered of such things, though always gently, with a bowed head, for madness was feared as much as any wound. And those who bore it were both pitied and kept at arm's length. Some grew quiet, never raising their voice again, while others grew short-tempered, unable to suffer the small frustrations of everyday life. Milk spilled, doors left ajar, children crying too loud. Have you ever watched someone forget how to smile? Truly forget, not out of stubbornness or grief, but as if the muscles themselves had lost the memory, like an old tune no longer hummed. That was the look they wore now, the survivors, the wanderers, the wounded in spirit who stood among the living but did not always feel alive. And the dreams, always the dreams, returned unbidden. Dreams were the battle played over and over, not always the same, but always familiar. Dreams where a brother called from the woods and could not be reached. Dreams where swords grew from the ground like weeds, where the dead walked through the village asking for bread. Dreams where the sound of bells marked not weddings or prayers, but the start of slaughter. Some took to sleeping in stables, where the smells of hay and animals offered comfort. Others beneath the stars, unable to bear the closeness of four walls. One man carved faces into wood, over and over, the same face, until his home was filled with hundreds of them, nailed to the beams and rafters, watching him as he moved, as if the act of creating might force the memory to take shape and leave him be. Another grew obsessed with water, drawing buckets again and again from the well, never drinking, just watching the ripples settle, as if expecting a voice to rise from the bottom. And yet another refused to speak altogether, communicating only through gestures, his voice locked somewhere behind his ribs, sealed up with fear or guilt or something neither he nor anyone else could name. And the villagers learned to live around them, not always understanding, not always kind, but never cruel, for all knew, in some small way, that what these men carried was the shadow of something larger than themselves. The toll of violence come due, and religion, too, played its part in these wounds, not just as balm but as weight, for many believed, with aching certainty, that what they had done in battle, what they had seen, had marked them before heaven's eyes. Confessions filled the chapels like fog, long, rambling weepings in the dark hours, men kneeling until their knees bled, begging to be absolved for the screams they could not forget, for the way they had struck down men begging for mercy, for the way they had laughed once, in the middle of it all, and hated themselves ever since. And the priests, for all their learning, had few answers. Some offered penance, some offered silence, some said that war was its own forgiveness, and others, quietly, admitted they did not know what to say to a man who had killed his cousin by accident, and now saw his face in every mirror. And so faith became a thread, thin, sometimes fraying, but still enough to hold on to, still enough to wrap around a piece of driftwood in the storm of memory. Charms became common, rings worn on chains, pieces of cloth blessed by monks, tiny bone relics tucked into boots, amulets carved with the names of saints who had once battled demons, as if the mind could be warded like a house against fire. And some turned to superstition, seeking answers not in scripture, but in the old ways, burning herbs to keep away night terrors, burying blood-stained tunics at crossroads, hanging bells above the door to trap wandering souls who might slip in through cracks in the floor. The line between madness and magic blurred in those days, as it always had, for when the world could not be explained, it was better to name it than to leave it nameless. And the villagers, even those untouched by battle, began to carry small behaviors of avoidance, crossing themselves twice at dusk, whispering a prayer before passing the old oak tree where a dying man had leaned and breathed his last, lighting extra candles during storms not just for light, but for remembrance. Children were told not to play near the stream where a horse had drowned, not because it was dangerous, but because its spirit might still linger. And old women began to leave bread at the chapel doorstep each week, a quiet offering to those whose spirits had not found peace. And in this strange blend of healing and haunting, life went on. Not cleanly, not fully, but truly. And perhaps this is what history forgets most often, that the aftermath is never tidy, never brief. That long after the swords have rusted and the trumpets have been silenced, the true war continues. In the quiet corners of the mind, in the slow breaths of men who flinch at firelight, in the tilt of a woman's head as she listens for footsteps that will never return. And over time, the faces change. The village grows, new children are born, new barns are raised, new roads carved through the hills. But beneath it all lies that sediment of sorrow, like ash beneath the topsoil, like dust in the corners of a long-abandoned room, always there, even when no one speaks of it. And if you were to walk through such a place, years later, decades even, you might not notice anything amiss, not at first, not unless you listen closely, not unless you watch the way an old man touched the scar beneath his collar as the church bell rang, not unless you saw how the tavern grew quiet when someone mentioned the year of the harvest fire, not unless you walked past the door and felt, without knowing why, that someone inside was remembering something far too large to ever be spoken aloud. And so it was not only the bodies that bore the weight of war, nor only the minds that trembled with memories sharp as spear tips in the dark. It was the world itself, reshaped slowly by fear, not in great declarations or banners, but in the daily choices that drifted like ash through village and manor, abbey and field, until they settled into new customs, new habits, new ways of being that no one had quite intended, but all came to accept. Have you ever noticed how fear, like water, finds its way into every crack, every quiet, unattended space? So too did the memory of battle creep into law, into architecture, into the very bones of the towns that remained. Stone walls grew thicker, not just around castles, but around grain stores, parish churches, and bridges. Places that had once felt open now ringed with cold. Stone and wooden gates, not as symbols of might, but as quiet shield against something that might return. Moats were dug where none had been before, not just around keeps, but around villages themselves, fed by diverted streams, maintained by reluctant labor, filled with reeds and frogs and the soft smell of wet decay. A barrier more symbolic than impenetrable, but one that offered peace of mind in the dark hours when the wind rattled shutters and the memories returned. Towns posted lookouts now, not always armed, but always watching. Men with weathered eyes and steady silence, chosen not for strength, but for calm, for the ability to see without panicking, to listen without flinching, and every nightfall came with a ritual. Doors bolted, candles snuffed, prayers whispered, dogs tied near thresholds, not for companionship, but for alarm. And trade shifted too. Routes once trusted grew feared, especially those that led through dense forest or lonely plains, where raiders might ride or soldiers might camp unannounced. Merchants formed convoys, not for profit but for protection, banding together under the creak of wagons and the flicker of shared torches, traveling not at dusk but at dawn, always in pairs, never sleeping under open sky if they could help it. And where once a man might have walked freely from village to village, now he carried a token or a letter from his lord, proof of identity, a parchment scrawled with a wax seal that marked him as known, as watched, as permitted, because in the wake of war, every stranger was a potential threat, every traveler a possible thief, every unknown face a flicker of past violence waiting to bloom again. Even language changed. Words once used for honor or valor took on darker shades, and new ones emerged. Old Norse or Latin roots twisted into terms for maiming, for siegecraft, for wounds that festered in limbs that were lost. Scribes began to catalog battles not only as events, but as warnings, their margins filled with drawings of broken spears and faceless knights, as if ink itself could carry the weight of memory forward into the hands of the next century. And the law turned harsher. Petty theft, once punished with fines, now earned a beating, and repeat offenses saw hands removed or tongues cut short, because a society wounded by chaos often seeks order through cruelty, imagining that pain might buy peace. Taxes increased, not all at once, but slowly, so that the people barely noticed. The cost of rebuilding, they were told, the cost of the king's mercy, the price of iron for new arms and wood for new towers, and those who could not pay in coin paid in labor. Their backs bent to the will of lords whose sons had died and who now sought to fortify what remained. Have you ever seen a village whose time has slowed, not just from aging, but from fear, from a kind of fatigue so deep it settles in the bones of the land itself, where markets no longer buzz, where laughter rings hollow, where every feast is shorter than the one before, and every birth greeted with both joy and worry? This was the rhythm now, across the realm, from low hills to riverbanks, from timber huts to stone manors. And children born in the years after battle heard its stories not as history, but as inherited memory. The way one speaks of storms or famines, events that ripple backward through generations, shaping behavior long after the cause is forgotten. They played differently too, no longer pretending at war, but at rebuilding, stacking stones, herding toy animals, pretending to plow fields instead of raise swords, as if instinctively trying to restore what had been broken before they were born. And the church, ever watchful, ever practical, shifted too, its sermons shaded darker, its homilies filled with reminders of wrath and penance, its saints redrawn with sterner gazes and swords in hand. Pilgrimages increased, not to seek miracles, but forgiveness, as if walking far enough, praying long enough, kneeling hard enough might scrub away the sins of killing, the sin of surviving. And monasteries filled with new novices, young men who had seen their fathers fall and chose cloister over sword, though even within those stone walls, the sounds of battle sometimes echoed in dreams, and the chants carried a quiet tremor, and those who ruled, the kings and barons and sheriffs, began to speak more often of duty and less of glory. Victory had cost them too much, and even the proudest among them began to avoid the old ballads of conquest, favoring quieter stories of peace, of grain, of weather, of trade. Scrolls once decorated with tales of siege and slaughter were now pressed with inventories of cattle and ledgers of wheat, as if bureaucracy might do what armies could not, preserve a world too fragile to risk again. And in all of this slow, subtle shift from open land to hedged fields, from freedom to fear, from joy to vigilance, there was no grand moment, no turning point to mark on a calendar or carve into stone. Rather, there was a great, aching settling, as if the land itself sighed and decided to endure, to sleep, to grow quiet. And perhaps this is the true legacy of war, not in banners or songs, but in the shape of a window built too narrow, in the way a well is hidden behind a hedge, in the path that curves around an old battlefield where no one builds, where no one speaks above a whisper. And over time, the memories softened, not erased, never that, but dulled like old blades, like footsteps worn into stone by centuries of silent passing. And the people adapted as people always do, building their lives atop the ruins of old fear, planting new wheat where the ground still whispered with blood, laying stones with hands that remembered but did not tremble. And so the world turned, not cleanly, not quickly, but steadily, until the generation that had seen the battle passed into stories. And the next lived their lives in houses built of caution and fields carved for memory. And the war became, at last, a shadow, still long, still cold, but no longer sharp, no longer bleeding. And in that shadow, life grew again, not strong perhaps, but stubborn, a single green shoot pressing through ash, reaching for sunlight without knowing why. And when centuries had passed, and the names of kings faded from memory, and the lineage of noble houses tangled like vines and vanished into dust, when the weapons had rusted into orange coils buried beneath sodden hills, and the last eyewitness to battle had long since returned to the earth, still the war remained, though quieter now, like the low hum of a forgotten song or the scent of wood smoke in an old cloak that hasn't been worn in years. Because war, once it touches a place, never truly leaves, not entirely. And though it loses its voice, it finds other ways to speak, softer ways, ways that settle into the grain of things. In a stone wall just slightly too thick for a farm boundary. In the strange bend of a village path that loops around a field no one tills, in a ring of trees. That the locals never fell because their roots drink deeply from soil that remembers blood. Have you ever walked through a place and felt something beneath the silence, something that isn't quite sorrow, but isn't quite peace either. That is the legacy of the battles no longer spoken of, where the ground bears witness long after the lips of men forget how. And the stories survive too, though never whole. Peace is passed from grandfather to granddaughter beside the hearth, offered like breadcrumbs, leading nowhere in particular. They say an army passed through here once, or that pond never freezes, not since the soldiers drank from it, or there's a cave in the hills where the wounded hid, and if you light a candle in the mouth of it, the flame won't flicker, and no one remembers where the stories came from, only that they must be true because they've always been said, and in the medieval world, that was enough. That was history. That was proof. That was the kind of knowledge that clung more stubbornly than parchment and endured longer than ink. The earth itself sometimes gave up pieces of truth when it was ready. Fragments of chainmail dug up by children weeding a garden, an iron spur bent into a knot of rust unearthed by a plow. A broken blade so old the hilt had turned to powder, its edge still faintly sharp, still heavy with meaning. These objects were passed from hand to hand with reverence, not because they were valuable, most were not, but because they were echoes, and to hold one was to be reminded that the very ground we walk upon remembers things we do not, that our feet press down on centuries of footsteps layered beneath us like dust on old wood. And in some towns, they built little shrines to such findings, not grand or gilded, but small alcoves in church walls or wooden shelves behind the altar where a helmet fragment or splintered lance could rest beside a relic or candle, as if in that place the sacred and the scarred might meet in quiet understanding. And the relics sparked stories anew, children inventing tales of knights who died defending sacred springs, of maidens who nursed the dying with only a flask of rainwater and a linen wrap, of arrows so fast they flew through 7 men in one shot, of angels who guided swords and demons who whispered before dawn. And none of these stories were true, perhaps, but all of them were real in the way that memory is real, shaped by love and fear and the need to explain why things are the way they are, why the wind howls through that hollow, even on clear days, why birds never nest in that one oak, why a certain stone door always jams during the autumn rains. And among the elderly, those in their twilight years, there lingered still a curious habit of pausing before certain meadows or looking twice at certain roads, even if they did not know why, even if their parents hadn't known why, even if it had been generations since anything had happened there. They simply felt it, the way the land shifted its weight, the way the shadows gathered early, the way silence sometimes felt heavier than sound. And in some places, memorials were built, not in the way we build them now, with plaques and names carved in granite, but in quiet acts. A single candle lit in the church window each midsummer, an annual walk taken in silence along a wooded path, a stone placed at the edge of a field, no name, just there, unmoving, reminding. And in song too, the war endured, though the words changed, and the meanings blurred, and the origins forgotten. Still the melodies passed from lute to voice to memory, hummed while tending sheep, whistled while repairing roofs, sung to restless children at bedtime. Melodies that told of bravery and loss, of homes burned and rebuilt, of a rider in red who never looked back, of a ghost who watched the harvest from the hill each year and wept when it was bountiful. And so history lived not in books, but in habits, in old songs with new verses, in the way bread was baked on certain days in silence, in the way no one drank from the well on the last night of October. Not because they feared, but because it was remembered. And in time, scholars came, scribes with quills and scrolls, monks with sandals dusty from weeks on the road, travelers who asked questions and wrote things down, who tried to piece together what had happened where, who had fought whom, who had died, who had won. But even they admitted, in the end, that much of it was lost, that the stories had grown too tangled, too worn to unwind, and that perhaps it was better that way. That perhaps the truest record of those horrific medieval battles lay not in books, but in the people who had lived through the aftermath, and the people who came after them, and the people who still, to this day, feel something stir when they step beneath an archway that feels too old for its surroundings. And have you ever picked up a stone, smooth and worn, and wondered who else had held it? Whether it once formed part of a tower, whether it lay in the hand of a dying soldier who stared at the sky and thought of spring. That, too, is part of the history, the quiet, the invisible, the intimate. And so the war became part of the air, part of the weather, part of the wrinkles in the faces of those who had never even heard the clash of steel but still bore the echo of it in the way they stared into the fire too long or rubbed their hands together before. Speaking of old roads, and over time, memory folded itself neatly into custom, and custom softened into myth, and myth, for all its twists and flourishes, never fully let go of truth. Because even the strangest tale has a root, and even the quietest village rests atop layers of grief. And so we sleep tonight not just in our own time, but in a house built atop the sleep of those before us. And the fields outside our window remember more than we ever will, and the wind that brushes the rooftops has passed over places that once knew fire and fury, and now only cradle stars. And if you lie still enough, long enough, you might even hear it, that soft voice, low and persistent, whispering of battles not to scare you, not to disturb your rest, but to remind you gently that peace, however imperfect, is something bought dearly, something shaped from sorrow, something made sacred by the simple act of surviving it. And as the long shadow of war slipped from memory into something deeper, something half seen and half believed, it did not vanish, not truly, but rather slipped into the margins of life, into the old wives' tales, the charms whispered over sleeping infants, the strange customs that no one remembered beginning but no one dared to end, because by then the horror of battle had ceased to be merely historical. It had become elemental, like fog that rolls in from the moors without warning, carrying with it something you cannot see but feel deep in your bones. And so battle, once a matter of sword and blood, became instead a matter of whispers and wards, a presence not on the field but in the hearth smoke, in the shadows at the edge of the woods, in the silence that falls when certain names are spoken. Have you ever heard of a superstition so old no one knows its reason, only that it must be followed? This was the way of post-war villages, with a past pressed in quietly through generations until belief itself became memory. People tied red ribbons around their livestock in the autumn, not because of wolves, but because once, it was said, an army disappeared during a harvest moon, and the only survivors were animals marked with blood-colored thread. They poured out the first cup of ale on winter nights for the unseen guests, not out of hospitality, but out of a flickering fear that the dead still wandered the fields when the frost was sharpest. Bells were rung at odd hours, not just to mark weddings or mass, but to drive away what they called March echoes, those phantom sounds of boots and hooves that some claimed they still heard on the old roads before dawn. Children were told not to walk alone past dusk, not because of bandits, but because of the mudmen, figures who rose from the marshy fields at twilight, their mouths full of silence and their eyes full of sorrow. Said to be souls of soldiers never buried proper, searching for the way home. And in certain parishes, it was said that when you felt the sudden urge to weep for no reason, it meant you had stepped through a place where something terrible had once occurred, a place where blood soaked too deep for rain to wash away, where grief had become part of the grass. And though the church offered structure, ritual, doctrine, it never quite managed to banish these things. Not entirely. For even the most pious priest would pause before passing the broken tower on the hill. And even the most educated monk would hesitate when a parishioner described a dream that matched too closely the tale of a soldier who had vanished generations before. And so folklore became both shield and vessel, holding memories that history had no space for, offering comfort not through logic but through rhythm, repetition, the safety of doing what had always been done. Swords unearthed by plowshares were not reforged or sold, but buried again with murmured apologies, or placed on chapel. Steps with a bundle of herbs and a coin for Saint Michael, who is said to weigh the souls of fallen warriors and lead the lost through fire toward forgiveness. Trees struck by lightning were fenced off, for those were believed to mark the place where a knight's soul had cried out, and the lightning was heaven's reply. And old women, the midwives and herb keepers, began to carry small iron nails sewn into their cloaks, not to use, but simply to ward off battle breath, an unseen sickness believed to rise from the earth on misty mornings, said to cause shaking hands and sudden tears. The very symptoms we now might name as trauma, but they only knew as haunting. They said you mustn't speak ill of crows, for crows had fed on the fields of war, and now carried messages between the living and the restless dead. Even the colors people wore were chosen with superstition in mind. Yellow on feast days to confuse spirits, brown for mourning so as not to attract notice, green never on Thursdays, for it was believed that was the color of betrayal and cowardice, of men who fled the battle and were cursed to walk backwards in the afterlife. And when storms came sudden and strong in the night, when lightning cracked open the sky and thunder rolled like drums over the hills, people whispered, "They're marching again," and some would light candles and place them in windows, so that if any lost soul were truly passing by, they might find warmth, however faint. And it was not uncommon, in homes that had stood for generations, to find a hidden bundle in the rafters or buried beneath the hearth, a pouch of herbs, bone, cloth, and coin, sleep not, meant to keep the dreams of war from entering the minds of the innocent. And these things were not spoken of openly, not mocked, not questioned, but accepted as part of the great unspoken understanding that the earth remembered, and so must they, quietly, carefully, through gesture and silence. And in this way, medieval people lived not just with the legacy of war, but inside it, breathing it in with the morning air, tasting it in the bread baked from soil once trodden by the boots of 1,000 dying men. And when visitors came, scholars, pilgrims, merchants, they often noticed these customs, but did not understand them, or else they laughed softly and called them provincial ways, not seeing how deeply the roots went, how these were not merely fears, but offerings, contracts, agreements between the living and the past. We will remember you. We will follow these strange steps, and in return, you will let us sleep. And when someone broke the pattern, when a new landowner cleared an ancient grove to build his barn, or when a noble refused to fund the annual lantern walk through the old field, the villagers grew quiet, the air thickened, accidents happened. The barn burned, the cattle fell sick, the noble's youngest child began to sleepwalk and speak in languages no one had taught him. And whether these things were true or not, whether they were coincidence or consequence, it did not matter, for belief is its own kind of history. And in the medieval world, belief was often more powerful than proof, and so generation upon generation followed these paths, not always knowing why, until the why no longer mattered, until the act itself became the answer, and the ritual its own reward. And slowly, these customs wove themselves into the broader tapestry of village life, blending with Christian feast days, overlapping with seasonal festivals, until no one could tell where folklore ended and faith began, and perhaps that was the safest place for memory to live. In the blurred space between candlelight and shadow, between song and silence, between fear and reverence. And if you ask an old man sitting by the fire why he still places boots side by side at night, toes facing the door, he might shrug and say, just in case. And if you asked, in case of what? He would only shake his head and say, you never know who walks the roads after dark, and then change the subject and stare a little too long into the flames. And that is how war survived. Not in history books, not in royal chronicles, but in the quiet things, in a bowl of salt kept by the bed, in a black ribbon tied around a lantern, in the hush that fell whenever thunder echoed too close, or whenever a certain melody was hummed and no one could remember who had first sung it, only that it made the room colder. And as you drift now, slowly, in a sleep, as your thoughts soften and your breath deepens, let this idea wrap gently around you. That history is not only the grand events, the named kings, the recorded dates, but also the worn path through the woods no one steps off of, the carved symbol above the barn door, the flower that always grows first at the edge of the graveyard, the one that no one picks. And now, rest, knowing that the past, however heavy, has already been carried for you. And in your dreams, if you hear soft footsteps in mist, or a distant drum far off in the hills, know that you are not in danger, only passing through old memory, old earth, where war once came and left behind not just scars, but stories. And in time, the very places where the screams once rang out, where hooves thundered and blades struck flesh and the sky turned black with smoke, those same hills and valleys, forests and meadows, grew quiet, not overnight and not without resistance, but gradually, persistently, as the centuries moved onward and the world, as it always does, grew around the bones of its own memories. Grass returned first, slow and soft, pushing its green fingers through the cracked clay where fires had burned and blood had dried, unfurling gently as if asking permission. And when no voices rose to stop it, it spread, moss clinging to fallen stones, vines creeping over rusted helmets, wildflowers nodding in the breeze where once arrows had flown. And soon the animals returned, not in great herds, but in curious pairs and quiet shadows. Deer stepping softly where cavalry once rode, foxes curling to sleep beneath splintered shields half buried in soil, crows, always the crows, perched on the crooked stumps of shattered trees, watching with glassy eyes as the land remembered itself, and the rains washed away what could be washed, char and soot, the thin black ash of campfires and pyres, the prints of boots long since rotted. But the deeper things, the things beneath, remained. The broken blades swallowed by the mud, the arrowheads lodged in tree trunks that kept growing, until they encased the violence in rings of bark like forgotten secrets. And slowly, these places lost their names. What had once been Red Hollow, or the Bone Ridge, or Bloody Field became Northwood, or Mill Pasture, or simply that far bit near the creek. And though the older folks still shivered when they passed near, their children did not, and their children's children saw only earth, only wildflowers, only sky. And so history slept there, not buried, not gone, but resting, pressed into the roots of elder trees, whispered into the soil by rain and frost, and the wind that never quite forgets. And have you ever stood in a place that felt older than it looked, where the air seems stiller, heavier, where even the birds sing softer, as if out of respect? Those are the places we speak of now, those quiet fields scattered across the medieval world, not marked by marble or iron, but by silence, by stillness, by a kind of hushed reverence too subtle for maps. And sometimes, long after the world had moved on, long after the lords who commanded and the serfs who fell had faded into time's great silence, a wanderer would stumble upon such a place, not by design, but by accident, perhaps while hunting mushrooms, or chasing a lost sheep, or simply walking to clear the mind. And they would pause without knowing why, glance around, frown slightly at the way the trees leaned or the wind shifted, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would feel it, that faint echo beneath the moss and grass, like a breath held too long, like a memory waiting to be remembered. And in rare moments, they might find something, an old coin, a buckle, the curve of the helm dulled to gray, or even bones pale and stubborn, pressed into the dirt with the persistence of centuries. And in that moment, history would lift her veil just a little, just enough for the present to blink and glimpse what once was, not just the battle, but the waiting before, the screaming during, the terrible, shivering quiet after. And yet, despite these moments, most went forgotten, and perhaps that was a kindness, for the land cannot grieve forever, and neither can people. And so the fields became farmland once more, seeded and tilled, the wheat rising golden each summer where men had once fallen, fed, perhaps by blood, though no one said it aloud. And the forests grew deeper, the trees older, until no one alive remembered that beneath their roots lay not only soil, but shattered swords and the curled, silent shells of what had once been men. And roads were built through some, cutting clean paths through sorrow, carriages rattling over ground that had once been soaked in cries. And yet no one heard them now, only the steady clip of hooves, the wooden creak of wheels, the soft chatter of travelers who did not know the cost of the land they crossed. And the churches nearby often bore no plaque, no bell, no prayer for the fallen. Just worn steps, quiet pews, candles lit for reasons long obscured. And perhaps that was fitting, for in a way, it is not the memory of war that demands shouting, but its passing, its quiet absorption into the earth. And in the surrounding villages, life went on. Children born, marriages held, fields sown and reaped, songs sung and forgotten. And all the while, beneath their feet, the past slept like a lion dreaming, great and heavy and slow, but no longer hungry. And even the songs changed. Once filled with the cadence of march and clash, now they softened, turned pastoral, romantic, humble. Melodies about harvest moons and spinning wheels and unrequited love, the old battle refrains remembered only in fragments, in the curious cadence of a lullaby or the chorus of a folk ballad, whose verses no one truly understood anymore. And thus, war became not myth, not warning, not pride, but backdrop, like the hills, like the rain, like the fading paint on chapel walls. Something there, but not quite seen, like a dream you half remember after waking. And it was only much later in distant lands, in great libraries or universities with tall windows and stone floors, that men and women would look back and ask, what happened here in these meadows and these woods? And they would dust off scrolls, flip through fading ledgers, trace names carved into the back of church pews, and try to find the battle once fought where now only birds sang. And then might come those scholars with maps and tools, brushing away centuries of leaf, mold, and loam, trying to understand what had occurred. And they might find something, a line of stones, a cluster of bones, the outline of a trench now soft with moss. And they would make notes and write articles and deliver lectures. But even they, for all their precision and knowledge, could never fully grasp the weight of it, the awful density of that hour when the sun turned red and the river ran thick and the shouts drowned the church bell. For that, only the land remembers, and the land does not speak, only breathes, only grows, only holds the dead gently, the way soil holds seeds, the way night holds stars. And so when you walk, even now, across a quiet hillside or a gentle plain, when you pause beneath an ancient tree Or dip your hand into a cold brook with stones worn smooth by centuries. Know that the world beneath your feet is older than you can imagine, and kinder than it should be, given what it has witnessed. And if you feel, even for a moment, that you're not alone, that something watches, not unkindly, from the trees or from the wind, do not be afraid. It is only memory, only time, only the earth's way of reminding you that peace is never free and never final, but always growing, like ivy over stone, like silence over sorrow, like dreams over history. And now, let your eyes soften, let your breath slow, for the battlefield sleeps, and so may you. And even as the great battles faded into soft shadows beneath the soil, even as names and dates blurred into fog and silence, the war did not vanish. It changed form, slipping from sword to symbol, from clash to cloth, from blood to brick and brush. For horror never simply disappears. It transforms, and in the medieval world, it found refuge in the things people made, in the objects they touched, the walls they built, the stories they told when no one else was listening. The memory of war, too painful to speak aloud, too massive to carry whole, was broken down and distributed across the realm like ash on the wind, settling in the hem of a tunic, the curve of an arch, the rhythm of a lullaby, the pattern on a tapestry that, at first glance, seemed to show only flowers. And in this way, the ordinary was steeped in the aftermath, not in mourning, but in quiet endurance, in the gentle act of acknowledging without naming, of remembering without reawakening. Have you ever looked closely at an old embroidery, not just admired its color or shape, but truly studied its lines? For many such works, stitched by hands calloused from years of harvest and hearth tending, hold hidden in their corners strange beasts, weeping trees, masked figures clutching broken swords or bleeding stars, symbols passed down from memory in a fabric, so that the horrors of war might be honored without overwhelming, so that what was once too loud might be spoken in thread instead of sound. And in the clothes people wore, subtle reminders abounded. A dark hem sewn around a tunic not for fashion, but to echo mourning bands, even generations after the loss had dulled, or the inclusion of a broken cross pattern near the collar, a nod to the brother who never returned, the father whose name was etched in no stone, only remembered in wool. Even colors took on new weight, as certain dyes came to signify not just rank or trade, but sorrow. Deep maroon, a color once reserved for luxury, came to mean loss in some regions, while dull green, the hue of earth and rot, was worn by widows and mothers on feast days, when joy had to be shared but not truly felt. And the houses, too, carried echoes of the battlefield, not just in their structure, though many were built with the caution of those who had seen walls fall, and knew the wisdom of stone over timber, but in their arrangement. Rooms without windows facing the road, doors reinforced with old iron, beams that bore the weight of both roof and memory. And within, the fireplaces held their own testimony, not just warmth but vigil, for many households kept an old shield or dinted helm mounted above the hearth, not as pride, but as warning, a reminder that comfort, once taken for granted, could vanish with the beat of a distant drum. And even the beds, those sanctuaries of rest, were shaped by war, narrower, closer to the ground, sometimes boxed in with curtains not just for warmth, but for a sense of enclosure, of safety, a habit formed when battle might spill through a village before sunrise. People slept lightly, not because they feared attack now, but because their ancestors had, and the body remembers what the mind forgets. And in their dreams, too, the past stirred, not always directly, but in symbols, crumbling towers, rivers that ran red, faceless men on horseback, Imagery passed like heirlooms through generations of sleep, shaping the subconscious landscape of a people who bore memory without language. And in the paintings that adorned chapel walls, the horror was transformed into parable, stylized into something sacred, bearable. Martyrs shown pierced not by mundane weapons, but glowing spears, halos placed over heads that might once have worn helmets. Agony reimagined as sanctity. And in this way, art became the soft vessel for trauma, giving shape to what could not be explained, allowing grief to be painted into petals, sorrow into saints. And have you ever noticed the way old village churches lean, ever so slightly, not from poor craftsmanship, but from time itself pressing against them? And how the stained glass glows dimmer in places, where soot from 100 years of candles has whispered its way into the corners. So too did war whisper into the corners of these. Sanctuaries not as violence, but as caution, as resilience, as the instinct to protect the holy from the unholy, the peace from the blade. And songs, too, changed, not always in lyric, but in cadence and tone. Once bright and lilting, the melodies darkened, slowed, grew minor in key, not because the people had lost their joy, but because they had learned the value of quiet beauty, of mourning woven gently into music. Mothers sang their children to sleep with tunes that told of rivers and clouds, and gentle beasts. But beneath the words was always a rhythm of survival, a steady lull that said, "You are safe, you are loved, we are still here." And some songs were never sung in public, but only hummed in kitchens or behind barn doors, their origins unknown, but their purpose clear, to soothe the soul's memory, to bind wounds the mind did not know it carried. And even tools bore the mark of transformation. Blades reforged into plowshares not just in literal act, but in spirit with farmers, tracing their fingers over the iron before use, muttering blessings passed down not from scripture, but from grandmother's lips, from a tradition older than parchment, older than stone. And the seasons themselves took on new customs. In spring, fields once battlefield were planted first, as if to offer a second chance, to coax life where death had once rooted too deeply. In summer, flowers were gathered from those same fields and placed not on graves, but in doorways and windows, offerings not of mourning, but of honor. In autumn, a portion of the harvest was always left behind, not out of neglect, but in quiet gift to the land, a gesture that said, "We have not forgotten." And in winter, when the nights grew long and the wind spoke in low tones around chimney and shutter, the stories returned. Not the loud, brave ones, but the soft ones, the ones that began with "they say" and ended with silence. And these stories, like the frost, settled in. Layers, each generation adding a line, forgetting another, until the tale itself became as much a part of the season as the snow. And in these ways, war was never truly gone, but softened, transformed, dispersed, taken in by the world, not as a thing to be feared forever, but as a thing to be respected, to be remembered gently. For the people of the medieval world, especially those who lived in its long echo, did not seek to glorify what had passed, nor erase it, but to live with it, not beside it, but within it, folding memory into the rhythm of their days, into the way they built, the way they prayed, the way they moved through the world. And perhaps in doing so, they found a form of peace not available to those who chase forgetting, who pretend the past can be sealed away, because they knew that war was not only a moment, but a shape, a thread that once cut could not be retied, but only rewoven into something new. And now, as your eyes begin to grow heavier and your breath grows slower, know that the things you touch each day, fabric, wood, melody, even silence, might still carry echoes of ancient hands, of lives once lived in the shadow of fear and the light of resilience. And let that knowledge soothe you, not trouble you. For the world is built of memory, and memory, when tended gently, becomes not burden, but comfort. And even in the most sacred spaces of the medieval world, in the hush of candlelit chapels and the echo of whispered prayers beneath arched stone ceilings, the shadow of war remained, not as noise, but as weight, as presence, as the quiet tension that curled around the edges of devotion and reshaped the soul's understanding of pain, mercy, and justice. For the Church, vast and ever-reaching, did not stand apart from the horrors of the battlefield, but instead absorbed them, translated them, sanctified them, until the cries of dying men found strange echoes in Scripture and bloodied fields became places of pilgrimage. Have you ever stood inside an old church and felt the air itself still, as if something long held its breath there? That stillness, that reverence edged with something heavier than holiness, is the echo of this time, when war pressed against faith until the two became inseparable. The wounds of Christ were spoken of more fervently after each campaign, not only because they mirrored the torn bodies of the fallen, but because they gave those wounds meaning, a divine framework through which to make sense of the senseless, to elevate suffering into sacrifice. And so sermons turned darker, more visceral, with preachers raising their voices to speak of swords and flames and the judgment of nations, while villagers bowed their heads not just in awe, but in fear. Fear not only of sin, but of a world that seemed so eager to spill blood, so quick to turn fields into altars. And saints who had once been known for healing or contemplation were increasingly remembered for their martyrdom, their suffering, their endurance. Saint Sebastian pierced not by symbolic arrows, but seen as a mirror for those riddled by real ones. Saint George not merely slayer of dragons, but warrior of the soul. And in this way, holiness was painted in shades of violence, and the faithful, in seeking comfort, were offered not peace, but passion, the promise that their pain, their loss, their constant generational fear was seen, was known, was part of a divine story too vast to understand but too close to ignore. And prayers changed, grew longer, more desperate, especially in border villages and towns near garrisons, where the threat of invasion, of press gangs and raiders, was not abstract, but lived in the creak of a door after dark. Deliver us from evil, they whispered, not as a phrase, but as a plea, and from swords, and from fire, and from the breaking of the house at midnight. Even blessings took on the flavor of fear, with travelers marked by crosses drawn in ash or oil, and children taught to murmur Latin phrases before bed, not to praise, but to protect. And in monasteries, the chroniclers, the quiet, ink-stained monks tasked with remembering, wrote accounts of battles not merely as history, but as spiritual reckoning, recording the omens before conflict, the miraculous survivals, the punishments that fell upon the wicked, the divine patterns glimpsed in chaos. And these accounts, copied and passed between abbeys, formed a kind of parallel scripture, unofficial but influential, in which war was not just politics, but parable, every arrow a message, every loss a lesson. And yet, even within the folds of faith, doubt lingered, whispers in cloisters, confessions murmured between sobs. Questions like, why must the innocent suffer? Why does the rain fall on graves and not blessings? Why did God allow such horror, such hunger, such heat from steel and flame? And though the priest had answers, always, sometimes the silence between words spoke louder, and even the most devout lit extra candles in the dark, not just for the dead, but for the questions they dared not voice aloud. And in some regions, new rituals emerged, not sanctioned but accepted, quiet ceremonies held in the field where no church stood, where women brought herbs and men brought bread, and prayers were spoken in whispers to the wind, asking not for salvation, but simply for rest, for the land, for the bones beneath it, for themselves. And gravesites became their own kind of chapel, marked not always with crosses, but with standing stones, carved only with simple signs, a spiral, a handprint, a single star. And these markers became places of pilgrimage too, in a quieter way, visited by those who needed no miracle, only memory. And among the clergy themselves, war reshaped the way they saw the world. Monks who had once lived lives of cloistered contemplation began to speak of worldly suffering with greater urgency. Priests who had given last rites on muddy fields preached differently, with less certainty, more grief. Even the architecture bore this shift, with churches built lower, thicker, more fortress than sanctuary, as if heaven too needed walls. And stained glass windows, once filled with bright blues and golden halos, began to show darker stories. Cain and Abel, David and Goliath, the harrowing of hell, chosen not for their triumphs, but their violence, their struggle, their blood. Have you ever seen a window where red overtakes the light, where the sun itself seems to weep as it passes through? In some places, it was said those windows cried during storms, as if they remembered, too, and behind the altars, tucked in niches or beneath loose stones, relics were hidden. Not only saintly bones or scraps of holy cloth, but tokens from the battlefield. A splintered arrow, a dented cross, a strip of blood-stained tabard wrapped in linen. Objects that had no place in relic catalogs, but which were treated with reverence nonetheless, held close in times of plague, famine, or invasion, as if the pain they carried might draw away pain from the living, like a wound absorbing another. And in confessions, war lingered too, men weeping for acts done under orders, women speaking of losses too great for words, young boys asking if it was sin to hate those who took their fathers, and old men asking if God had forgiven them, though they had never forgiven themselves. And the priests listened, and nodded, and offered absolution not as authority, but as balm, knowing that sometimes forgiveness must be spoken aloud to begin its work. And the bells that rang across valleys, once used to mark joy, now rang also for warnings, for fires, for raids, for mobilizations. And so their sound, while still sacred, became tinged with dread, a toll that struck through the heart as surely as any blade. And the people learned to read their echoes, the slow bell of peace, the sharp clang of danger, the rhythmic chime for the dead. And through all this, the idea of heaven itself began to shift, not just a paradise of light and song, but a place of reunion, a place of rest after horror, a promise that the chaos of earth would one day be sorted, that every lost son, every vanished brother, every weeping widow would find closure in the beyond. And hell, once a fiery realm of abstract punishment, became suddenly more real, its descriptions echoing too closely the scenes seen on fields not far from home. Burning bodies, screams, blood that refused to wash away, so that preachers had only to gesture toward recent memory, not ancient myth. And in this way, the horrors of medieval war did not remain outside the walls of churches or within the pages of annals, but became threads in the tapestry of spiritual life, binding belief and blood in ways both terrible and tender. And perhaps, in their own strange way, these transformations brought comfort. Not the soft comfort of ignorance, but the firmer kind that comes from being seen, from knowing that even the church, even the sacred, did not turn away from the suffering of the world, but met it, held it, named it holy. And now, as your breath deepens and the stillness of night surrounds you like cathedral stone, Let these thoughts drift not as burdens, but as quiet knowledge that even in the darkest hours of history, people sought meaning, sought mercy, sought peace, and that their seeking, their prayers, their rituals, their silent strength have woven the world you sleep in now. So close your eyes and rest, for the bells have rung, the candles are low, and all that remains is the hush of old, prayers echoing into the stars. And now, as we arrive at the quietest edge of this long journey through time and shadow, as the last embers of memory glow softly in the hearth of your mind, let's turn our gaze gently backward, not to linger, but simply to honor the path we have traced together, through blood-soaked fields and firelit cathedrals, through whispered superstitions and quiet rituals, through the ghosts not of terror, but of tenderness, of those who suffered and endured and left behind echoes so gentle, so faded, they now feel like the breath of wind across sleeping meadows. We began in the roar of war, in the clang of steel and the weight of chain mail, and we end now in stillness, in the hush that follows not only battle, but centuries, the hush that overtakes all things in time, even fear. For what was once horrific, unbearable, immediate, has softened over the ages, not into forgetfulness, but into something else, into lullaby, into soil, into quiet collective. Memory that hums beneath our feet and flickers in the silence between thoughts. And have you ever truly noticed, how even the most terrible stories can become gentle in the telling? Not because they lose their truth, but because time, like a mother smoothing a child's hair, tempers the sharpness, dulls the blade, turns the shriek into a sigh. So it is with war, especially the wars of the medieval world, so full of noise and pain and smoke, but now receding, like mist at morning, into hills, into stone, into legend and dream. And it is in this dreamy state, somewhere between sleep and waking, that the past lies most kindly, not as lesson, not as warning, but simply as presence, as a low hum beneath the stars, reminding us that everything we know, everything we rest upon was once earned dearly by those who walked through horror so that we might walk through gardens. And so we owe them not just remembrance, but peace, not loud tributes or monuments, but silence, warm and unbroken, the kind of silence that drapes the world in velvet and allows grief to settle, finally, into something sacred. And perhaps the truest form of honor is rest itself, not an action, but the deliberate, tender decision to lay down one's arms, to soften one's breath, to let the long echoes pass through us without resistance, to close the eyes not in fear, but in trust. And as we close this story now, we find ourselves not in a battlefield or a throne room or a monastery, but somewhere far simpler. A small stone cottage at the edge of a field, where the fire has burned low and the candle is guttered into wax, and outside, the wind stirs the leaves with a voice like memory, like a lullaby you half remember from childhood, and overhead the sky is ink dark and silver dusted. The stars indifferent but beautiful, exactly as they were when arrows flew and swords fell and kings cried out for heaven's mercy. And inside that cottage, someone, perhaps someone like you, is folding a wool blanket, brushing dust from a wooden floor, pouring the last of the tea into a heavy clay cup, not as ceremony, but as life, as the quiet continuation of everything that came before. For the past does not end. It only settles deeper and deeper into the earth, into the walls, into the rhythm of breath and sleep. And that is where we meet it, not on battlefields, but in dreams, where the dead no longer scream, but speak gently, and the sorrow does not wound, but warms. And even now, somewhere in the world, the ruins of a forgotten keep stand overgrown, moss soft and owl haunted, and no one who passes by remembers the names carved into its stone, but they pause anyway and lower their voices and leave a stone or a flower at its base, not because they know, but because something within them does, something old, something tender, something that recognizes pain and responds not with fear but with care. And you listening now, drifting now, are part of that long echo, that ancient kindness. We carry the past not to be burdened, but to cradle it, to rock it gently into peace. And when you sleep, truly sleep, the past sleeps with you. Not in a haunted way, but in the way of stories told beside a crackling fire, in the way of lullabies hummed against the shoulder, in the way of prayers whispered without words. And now, your breath is slower, softer, like waves touching the shore of a forgotten island, like wine through tall grass that no longer remembers the footfalls of war. And your body, warm and safe, is no longer a soldier's armor or a peasant's labor or a priest's penance, but simply a body, a temple for stillness, for silence, for sleep. And what remains now is only peace. Peace. And the gentle gratitude of having listened, having remembered, having opened yourself to stories that mattered once and still do, in ways too deep for history to measure. So let the field go quiet, let the bells cease their toll, let the crows find other skies and the drums lose their rhythm. Let the war end, not with fanfare, but with a sigh, for you are safe now, and the world, whatever its wounds, is holding you in its quiet arms, asking nothing more than that you rest. And so I'll leave you here, with the candle low and the stars high, with the story told and the silence blooming gently around your thoughts. And as your mind slips further into the softest dark, into the warm folds of sleep, may you carry with you only this, the knowledge that horror fades, that even the worst things soften with time, and that sleep, more than anything, is an act of mercy we give ourselves. Now, let your thoughts wander, let the voices of history dissolve in a hush, let the past become a lullaby, and the night carry you home. I'll see you in another timeline. Good night.